of the plane. A total of 10 people died in the September 4th crash. The NTSB determined a piece that controlled the stabilizer on the seaplane's tails failed and caused the crash. So now relatives of those lost are suing Renton-based Northwest Seaplanes and de Havilland Aircraft of Canada, claiming that the crash was entirely preventable. But the companies did inspect the planes properly. The three parallel lawsuits were also filed in King County Superior Court. And the air quality is looking moderate around most of the region and unhealthy for sensitive groups closer to the Washington Canada border, where we've got some wildfires still burning. We won't see much improvement over the weekend. In fact, the air quality conditions may drop a little bit this weekend, but not nearly as bad as they were last weekend. And I hope you're having a wonderful Friday. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of any size to attract, interview, and hire candidates, all from one place. More at Indeed.com/NPR.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. Your week may have included 40 hours of work, but could you have gotten it all done in 32 hours? San Juan County answered that question for itself this week. We'll discuss that and the rest of the week's news with the stranger staff writer, Vivian McCall. Welcome, Vivian.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. Geekwire contributing editor, Mike Lewis. Hiya, Mike.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, actually, at this point, yeah.
Yeah, 12 bells. Seattle Times editorial board member and columnist, Claudia Rowe. Hi, Claudia.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Seattle air quality, by the way, officially moderate. Can you always tell what's hazy and what's smoke anymore? I feel like I live in another world at all times. And the state fair, Evergreen State Fair, just started in Monroe. Puyallup Fair begins next week. Do we need to move our state fairs past smoke season? Is it time to reconsider that? Oh, Claudia, you look sad.
State fair is a summer harvest, the huge zucchini.
Yes.
It's got to be what it is.
Okay. Maybe it makes the roller coaster even scarier, even spookier. Okay. You can watch the show if you like, because we do live stream it on YouTube and Facebook. Don't just stare at Donald Trump's mugshot. Stare at us instead. If you just search KUOW Public Radio. Okay, let's begin with our first topic this week. The last captive southern resident orca died on Friday in Miami. Tokitae was one of dozens of whales herded and captured from Puget Sound in the 1970s and put on display in places like Miami Seaquarium. For years, the Lummi Nation and others called for the release of Tokitae, later called Salish Sea, back to the Salish Sea, back to her family, including back to the orca who is believed to be her mother, who is still alive. Earlier this year, Seaquairium agreed to release her, but she didn't make it home. Whale researcher Howard Garrett with Orca Network says he's still processing the grief over Tokitae, and he knows that grief is widespread.
It's massive. It's global. It's certainly intense. All the people who cared so much and followed her so strongly for so long, they're all reeling now, and so we're going to share our grief.
The former chair of the Lummi Nation, Jay Julius, says he wanted this orca to die next to family, not in a prison cell, but he said she must be feeling tremendous peace to finally be freed.
An example of strength and love and resilience. Her story will live on, and I think her passing opens up the door for truth-telling about us humans and our policies, and allow us to ask ourselves who we become. It is sad for us because we forever have to live with the reality of what humans put her through.
We forever have to live with the reality of what humans put her through. The Lummi Nation also requested Tokitae's body be brought home. Instead, it was sent to Georgia for an autopsy, which the current chair of the Lummi Nation, Tony Hilaire, says happened without the tribe's consent.
We see her as a family member. The last thing we want to imagine or think about is what they're doing to her. Things being done to her without talking to us.
According to the Seattle Times, the owner of Miami Seaquarium says the autopsy had to happen as fast as possible to get the best answers as to why she died. The Times also reported that Tokitae's body was cut into pieces and put in 50-gallon barrels. And now her remains either will or already have been cremated. Claudia, your colleague Linda Mapes has been reporting on all of this week.
I think Linda Mapes' stories really bring it home. I mean, she's a fantastic writer and reporter. And at the risk of anthropomorphizing, at a being that isn't human, she did, I don't want to say humanize, but she did sort of help readers really feel the impact of the story. And I think the story really shows us, your lead-in says what we've become, but it in a sense, it shows the sort of the journey of awakening, of realization, right? In 1965, the person who captured her was hailed as a hero, given the key to the city in Seattle.
Yeah, these whales were shot at. They were considered pests. Fishers hated them.
Right. And now he's being questioned and is saying, no regrets, which is sort of a defensive posture.
No regrets about him capturing Tokitae.
That's what he's quoted as saying. Yeah.
Any other reactions?
I think that it's nice to see the end of an era. It's not this specific occurrence obviously isn't nice. It's a tragedy for a lot of folks, but it's nice to see that this is being covered in the manner that it's covered, because most people, especially I would guess young people, are kind of astonished, right, that we would go out and hunt and inadvertently kill and then over time kill orcas. I don't know why the aquarium needed an autopsy. I think we can all say what it died from, right? At a distance. And so I'm glad. And if the remains are returned, I'd be happy about it. I guess cremains are returned. I'd be happy about that. But there's one weird thing, and maybe I'm going to stand outside of what the normal reaction is. I am in a weird way relieved that this whale wasn't reintroduced. Because I think
the whale was being shipped back home,
being
to be
shipped back,
reintroduced.
being paid for, oddly enough, by the owner of the Indianapolis Colts, who became Jim Israel, who became sort of obsessed with this particular story. And I appreciate where he's coming from, and I appreciate the desire to bring this orca back. But I could see in my head the when we were following the story of the orca who was supporting its deceased calf.
Yes.
Which was
like carrying it
was
around.
Heartbreaking, right, to watch. And I just had the sense that this was going to go an orca that's been in captivity for 50 years. To Claudia's point about anthropomorphizing, always a difficult radio word. The idea of watching all of everyone reporting on what was going to be an extremely difficult reintroduction by anyone's estimation, including the orca experts. I'm not saying I'm happy that that Tokitae died, but I am saying that would have been excruciating, I think, to watch.
Even if it was excruciating, it could have also been the right thing to do. You said something about humanizing. I don't even think you have to. And I think we're so foolish for not realizing so much earlier that, marine mammals like dolphins and orcas are intelligent beyond our understanding. They have language. They have what you would define as culture. They have complex family structures. They are fully conscious beings. And it's very sad that for such a long time, we thought that it was appropriate to put them in a pen where they swam in circles and lived very unfulfilling and small lives for such a kind of magnificent creature. And it still makes me sad that she never saw the water again or her family.
It's very sad, though, of course, putting whales and dolphins in shows for the public to perform is what eventually turned the light on for the public about the intelligence of these creatures. Would we have recognized it anyway? Probably, eventually, but surely those kinds of exhibitions are what made people realize, hey, there's a much more complex intelligence here.
I think that there is some truth to that. I think it's still wrong. I think that we ever did it, and it's sad that some whales had to live the lives that they did for us to just realize that maybe something other than human beings has worth and intelligence and presence and importance in the world.
Well, we went through this at Woodland Park Zoo with the elephants a few years ago, and it does, I don't know how that issue has resolved itself, elephants and zoos versus sanctuaries, but it makes me wonder what's the next large animal to be.
Weirdly enough, I know a little bit about how this has resolved itself because a family friend is a zoo interior architect, and it's not the whole process of even having elephants in zoos is going to go away, and it's going away kind of slowly at this point. I mean, I think that the same, you could argue down the animal chain about whether or not animals should be in captivity. I'm kind of uncomfortable with it, but I think that this is going the same way as the orca.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's the first topic on KUOW's Week in Review. And by the way, you are invited to, there's a sort of memorial service, a celebration of the life of Skale Chaktonat Tokitae coming up on Sunday. And the public part of that ceremony is noon to 3 at Jackson Beach Park on San Juan Island. And the Lummi Nation invites you to come to that part of it. Tribal members are traveling to the University of Georgia and will drum for this orca and then bring her ashes home. And I also read in the Seattle Times, castings will be made of her larger bones for skeletal displays. I don't know where those are going to be on display, but we will, I imagine, have a reporter there this weekend and continue to follow that story and the story of other, especially large animals in captivity. You're listening to Week in Review on KUOW Seattle, and our second topic today has to do with crime in the city. It's something we address a lot on this show, and there was yet another mass shooting in Seattle this week, early Sunday morning, in the parking lot of Rainier Hookah Lounge in Mount Baker. 3 people killed, ages 22, 30, and 32. 6 people hurt, 1 in critical condition. One of the people killed was the sister of a staffer of King County Council member Gurmai Zahalai, who said she was an innocent bystander who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. This is Seattle's 3rd mass shooting this summer. And Claudia, you went to a community meeting this week. What happened there?
It was, as you might expect, enormous sadness, enormous criticism for the police, for the city council, who were blasted and blamed for discussions about defunding the police, which didn't happen to the degree that they were discussed. However, we all know there's many fewer officers on the force now. I actually think there are a couple of things going on. It is now fairly clear that, I mean, the new precinct captain down there said most of the shootings are, he said, have a nexus of gangs. So, connected in some way. In my experience, gangs don't care all that much about police presence. They're going to do what they do. I don't know that more police means less gang activity. In 2008, there were many kids shot in gang-related skirmishes, and we weren't having this police manpower problem to the same degree then, and presumably there were cops on the streets, and it didn't seem to matter. There were lots of kids getting killed. So, however, that was the feeling at that meeting. The police were just, getting blasted for not being there, but then the city council blasted for precipitating, the departure of many police.
I think also that one of the things that I think the city should look at least in conjunction with Seattle Unified School District, and perhaps the private schools as sort of a partner in all of this, is the idea of after school activities. I mean, there's a very few things that seem to actually stem in places like Baltimore and places like Chicago that seem to stem violence. And this is dealing specifically with youth violence, but that certainly is a component. And it certainly is, when it's unchecked there, it becomes adult violence later on. But that after school activities tend to keep people occupied, but it also keeps people building relationships, and they feel like that building that relationship, that sort of social network, the literal social network, not the electronic version, actually goes a long way. And there's been quite a few studies that said this is effective, but we've de-emphasized that. We've pushed a lot of the after school stuff to, if it's sports, to these travel teams and expensive things, right? And away from actual just school participation. And if you talk to teachers and if you talk to social workers, they all seem to think that particularly like the spiking in youth violence tends to happen like 4 p.m., something like that statistically, that if you have people involved in the kids involved in things like this in a consistent way that is funded all the time, that has not just sports, but drama and other classes, things like that for after school, that you can actually make at least a starter effort at this that can then lead, hopefully, when kids are passing through that really those vulnerable years, into something that's a little more long term. I'm not saying that that's the only solution here. There's obviously a variety, but I think that's one of the ones that seems to be a little closer in control at a city level.
I'd also push back. I think whenever you have events like this these days, some of the first things that people jump to is, oh, this is the fault of defund the police. But it's the expectation that we would be living in a better city if there was an officer on every street corner to anticipate something happening. Would that be a safer city? Who is that a safer city for? Would that be a better city to live in? And who would that be a better city to live in for? I just don't think that is necessarily the solution to what is often a social problem that is rooted in disenfranchisement and poverty and just economic need. It is not a situation that you can really solve with law enforcement.
Claudia, you talked about 2008. You used the example of being a time of shootings without the police understaffing, and you're on the Seattle Times editorial board. Does the board take a position on whether more cops means a safer city?
We haven't discussed it in terms of this most recent issue. The board has certainly taken a position in terms of the defund discussion and how damaging that turned out to be. In large part because it was a discussion started without a real plan on the other side,
without
right?
an alternative,
right? Without anything in place to sort of answer the legitimate need of more social workers, more public health workers, more sort of other folks who can respond to an incident. But the discussion and the beginnings toward defunding, were cut off before they got all the way to where they were aiming. I mean, it never ended up being a 50% cut as was initially discussed. However, there wasn't stood up enough of an infrastructure, I think, to balance it.
No. The mayor's office said this week that crime levels citywide have dipped in the first half of this year. Just a few numbers: 17% drop in all major reported crimes anyway, compared to the same time last year, 13% decrease in reports of violent crime, 7% reduction in shootings. However, homicides are outpacing last year so far. Mike, I could quote statistics all day long. The FBI's list of top 20 cities for crime, Seattle's nowhere on that list. You ask people how safe or dangerous Seattle is, and they seem to make up their own answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always liked to track is over at Seattle University, Jackie Helfgott's survey that she does every year regarding the disparity between people's perception of crime and actual crime. And you can literally overlay the data. And in some neighborhoods, weirdly enough, some neighborhoods where crime is a little worse than normal, there people don't perceive it as such. And in the opposite is certainly true. In neighborhoods that are relatively nice, relatively low crime, there seems to be a perception that every tent out there is somehow like a secret crime den. And I think that part of this gets fed obviously by social media. I think Nextdoor is kind of notorious for people just like throwing in every little thing in the neighborhood and making people feel like the wolf is at the door. I think Facebook does a lot of this as well, other forms of social media. And you find that places that have lower engagement in these sort of things tend to have a different perception of crime. Seattle is a relatively, at least statistically, a relatively safe big city. I mean, not just from a United States standpoint, but from a worldwide standpoint. I'm not suggesting that means that there's not problems. I'm just saying that the perception and the reality, at least statistically, don't matter. But if you see something, or if you experience it personally, if your house gets broken into, you're completely recalibrated on how you see crime. And I'm sympathetic to that as well, obviously.
Also, Seattle as a whole, sure, but in certain pockets, say the Rainier Valley,
Right.
not at all. I
Right.
mean, people at this meeting on Wednesday were using the word mayhem.
People who live there.
Correct. People who live there were saying it's mayhem. Today I spoke with somebody who called it a war zone. I don't know if that's overstating it, but
Sounds like it's overstating it.
but well, perhaps, but the numbers are, much higher there, and they're much higher than they were last year, and they're much higher than they were in, 10 years ago.
Mhm.
So I think if you live there, you have the right to make that statement.
That's what I mean. Exactly right. When it's personal.
But I think also a lot of the people who are really saying like Seattle isn't safe anymore and Seattle is dying, they're not the ones who are living in those neighborhoods. And I think you can tell that something is funky with the perception if your political beliefs determine how safe you feel in a particular city. Like when you look at, the perception of Republicans and Democrats about Seattle, like you can't look at those numbers without taking into account that Seattle and the right-wing media is like this example of how progressive policies have gone wrong and people run amok, which is mostly it's mostly for political reasons. And it's also based, like you said, on anti-homeless bias and the idea that like Seattle is just destined to fall apart because of the political beliefs and the policies here, which has nothing to do with reality and it has nothing to do with solving an actual problem that affects people.
I don't know whether I can separate my politics and my personal biases from my perceptions. Are anyone here able to? I
try
have
to.
trouble. Yeah, I try.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that necessarily whether or not we should, but I get the idea. But if you look statistically nationally at cities that are relatively Oklahoma City, relatively conservative city council, and or Birmingham, Alabama, or Seattle or Detroit, you find a strong correlation in crime rates have gone up over the last 10 years in many of these cities, whether or not it was run by a progressive city council or not.
Mm-hmm.
And you've seen also a statistical drop when employment starts to go up. You almost always see a correlation in drop in crime, whether or not where your politics land.
Yeah.
But I do think that I think depending on what media you're consuming, and that's maybe what I should have added in when I was talking about social media, you're getting this constant stream and you're constantly getting agitated that things are bad, things are getting worse, and things are a threat. And you hear people talk about it in a manner that you would think that they were living in like to Claudia's point earlier, in an actual war zone and not in a good neighborhood, much less in a neighborhood where there's a higher crime rate. I do think, though, that where you live in town and what you experience fundamentally should shape the way you see crime.
Absolutely. And, when people come here from other places, they're shocked. I was talking with somebody who came here from Georgia earlier in the summer from the Atlanta area. He was astounded at the sort of hysteria over crime here. He laughed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have
friends,
a friend from Detroit.
Baltimore, Chicago.
I moved here
right?
from Chicago,
Yeah.
and when people were like, "It is so dangerous here," I was like, "Okay." And also, when I lived in Chicago, I was mugged, and it didn't make me feel like the city was ultimately more dangerous. It was something that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we do need to take a break. Unfortunately, my blog about how nothing happened to me yesterday at my bus stop at 2nd and Yesler over by Union Gospel Mission, just like the day before and the month before that and the month before. No one's reading my my blog about that. I'm just my next door is crushing me in the competition. Okay, we're going to take a short break and come right back with more Week in Review. So don't go away.
.949 KUOW Seattle. It's 12:29. 70 degrees in Seattle, sunny and hazy. Our air quality is moderate across most of the Puget Sound region. Today's expected high is 83.
You can listen to KUOW on your Sunday road trip or waiting at your gate at the airport, finally taking that big trip. No matter where your journey takes you, you can take unique storytelling, local reporting, and in-depth conversations with you wherever you go. Stream live now on KUOW.org.
Support for KUOW comes from STG, presenting the OJ's Last Stop on the Love Train, the final tour, October 19th at the Paramount Theater. Tickets available at stgpresents.org.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke with my panel, the Seattle Times Claudia Rowe, Geekwire's Mike Lewis, and the Strangers' Vivian McCall. Hey, our daily news podcast, Seattle Now, is coming to Fremont Abbey Arts tonight. I'm speaking on the live show, Friday, August 25th, the music edition, Seattle Now Live. What is Seattle's musical identity today, and what do local musicians think about where music is going, local venues, performance? It's going to be fun tonight, 7:30 at Fremont Abbey Arts. Let's get back into the news of the week. And what may be a first in the USA, San Juan County will move its unionized government employees to a 32-hour work week, and their salaries remain the same. County Human Resources Director Angie Baird says the county couldn't afford big cost of living wage increases, so they found another way.
In today's world, employees have more choices. We have to be creative. And how do we still entice people to want to work in public service?
The county said they're not taking away any public services its workers provide now, though some departments may be open less. Isn't being open less taking away some public services? Can they get everything done?
I like the idea of 30, I guess, I joined the masses who appreciate a 32-hour work week if it actually can exist.
Our listeners we asked them, overwhelmingly thrilled about shrinking the work week.
Not because they're avoiding work while they're listening to your show,
obviously.
but I do on the public service level. The one thing that I would say is a caveat. Obviously, they're saying no emergency services. If you're doing that, you're still working a full week.
Right.
But I would say that to the extent that people have to go to city or county municipal services and get something done, either they need something fixed, they need to get a permit, they need to do the variety of things that we have to do to interact with government. As long as those the counters where people actually interact with the city are still staffed well and consistently, I think the 32-hour work week is great. I would be thrilled for people getting that.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. And I also think that the city is or the county, is trying something, and they're going to evaluate it at 6 months, and they're going to evaluate it again when the contract is up for renewal. And I mean, I think we'll see whether it works or whether there are major problems with county services. But there is, some evidence from the UK. There hasn't been a ton of study on what this looks like because we haven't really done this in a lot of places, that it could increase productivity. And maybe if people are going for those county services, maybe those county services are going to get better. They're going to pick up because people are living happier, better lives where they get to spend more time with their family.
It really seems to be a matter of intelligent, creative scheduling and budgeting. And if managers can make sure, as Mike says, that people are there to staff the windows and be there at the normally prescribed hours, and maybe that means moving people to perhaps different days, right? It didn't say that the 32 hours have to be Monday through Friday, like maybe you work Monday through Thursday or Tuesday through Friday or whatever, move people around. I don't think this is terribly controversial. I think it's going to work. I think everybody knows that there's a lot of wasted time in the 40-hour work week. I think people know that.
Well, and the 40-hour work week is tradition, but it's not sacrosanct. I mean, this is not something we do it because this is what we've always done. But whenever anyone steps outside and thinks of something new, working from home would be a great example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Turns out it actually works. I was talking a couple of years ago with the chief people officer, I think that's the title, of Expedia. And she said one of the things that was very interesting about working from home, because Expedia has always been a company that has had people working from a variety of places all over the planet.
They're really into people being in different places.
They are. That seems to be sort of a bottom line for them. And she said what companies are also facing is this ability to track what is successful work and what isn't when you don't have people in there, because a lot of people were liked and promoted based on personality, but less on work quality, right? And people sometimes didn't get that if they were not as friendly, in the workplace, but their work quality was good. Yeah. I think the tracking mechanism in San Juan County is going to be very interesting on how they assess whether or not what is productivity and how do you track it.
I was talking with a county worker from San Juan County earlier, who is really excited about this and thinks that they're going to be on, the leading edge of something much broader, sort of a sweeping new trend. I think that's on the money. I think that's what's going to happen.
Well, this echoes what we asked our listeners what they thought of this. As I said, overwhelmingly happy. Daniel in Seattle says, I would definitely be more efficient with a 4-day work week. I spend a large amount of time, at least 1/5, not working in any given week, not due to laziness, just because there's nothing to do. Chelsea from First Hill says, I'm super excited to see this concept spreading. Most weeks I can get my work done in 32 hours. However, beware that statistic, because if San Juan County wants to react to that by having employees work less for the same money, joy to the world, if everyone's happy. But your county's reaction to that higher productivity might be to expect workers to get more done now that they're so productive, right? More than they were doing before. It's not like a finite amount of work necessarily. Exactly. And if they can't think of any more work to do, they might get laid off. I mean, that the 32-hour work week, keep your salary, is not the only reaction we might see to our higher productivity, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, silence. I guess we'll leave it there.
Yes.
Okay. Mostly joy for a 32-hour work week. And if you want to weigh in yourself, dear listener, join our community feedback club. Just text the word club to the number 206-926-9955. Again, 206-926-9955. Text the word club and we'll send you a text sometimes asking for your feedback, your story ideas. Okay, meanwhile, since we're talking union, and those are unionized workers, no surprise at San Juan County workers. Now I want to switch to unionized workers at the Washington State Department of Children, Youth, and Families, who, Claudia, have launched a no confidence vote against their boss. Why do these workers want the governor to fire and replace a state secretary?
There are a couple things going on here. Recruitment and retention is a true problem among caseworkers in child protective services, and caseloads are very high. So just in terms of the workload, that's one thing. So that's sort of a morale issue. And that's chronic. I mean, that was true before the creation of DCYF in 2019. It was true when Child Protective Services was under the Children's Administration and DSHS. It's a pretty rough job, right? I mean, it's going to take a certain kind of person who wants to do that job. And it's a very, very high burnout and turnover always. Is that the fault of the boss at the top? Certainly the boss at the top sets a tone. What the workers really wanted was for Governor Inslee to step in and force conversation, discussion with the secretary. They felt that the secretary wasn't really hearing them, wasn't really paying attention to them. And I think that is really what they want, not so much fire this person. And I don't think that would advance their aims. It would just create more instability, and that's not going to attract new staff, right? What they want is to be heard. There's also a larger thing going on, which is a really important shift. A new law was passed that raises the bar for when you can remove children from their families and put them in foster care. That law took effect in July, and it puts a great deal more stress on the caseworker to connect families with services that we may not have at the levels that they need to be, similar to the defund issue, without having sort of the social worker and other supports to back up the cops. Same thing here. There's a lot more that a caseworker needs to do to interact with a family and to ascertain the situation before removing a kid. Much more focus on services and family preservation. Wherever you fall on whether that's right or wrong, this is a huge shift. And, you know, the metaphor of the ocean liner slowly turning is apt here. So this just took effect this summer. It's going to take a while to smooth out.
I got a question for you, Claudia. What does the vote of no confidence? One, it's still short of that. I think there's a threshold for this, right?
Correct. They need to get 1,855 votes. And at this morning I checked, this is an ongoing
By when?
by Labor Day.
Okay.
This morning I checked and they were at 1,487.
So they're still a fair bit short.
They're still short.
Yeah. And so if they don't get that vote of, I mean, then the boss knows they don't have confidence, but nothing really changes, right? I mean, that's not an edict that the boss needs to do anything different.
Well,
right?
I agree with where I think you're going. I think this was a very high risk move on the
Right.
part of the union for this exact reason, right? Like if you don't get the votes, then you're in a weaker position. And whether you do or you don't get the votes and whatever the governor does, now your boss, you're working for somebody who you tried to oust. That's not going to be a comfortable position.
Well, and one other quick question. So what is, I mean, Inslee is on the way out. Like, what's Inslee's incentive to do any disruption at this particular point?
Exactly.
Right.
Right now, what do the problems that they are raising here and the high caseloads, what are those actually doing for the people who are receiving these services? Is it really affecting them? Are kids stuck in abusive or bad environments for longer because of that?
I think it's a bit early to say. However, there is some data to suggest that near fatalities, so they track this, fatalities and near fatalities. And I did look at a report on this earlier this summer, and it was not great. It's never great, right? I mean, I don't know that it was screamingly worse than before the implementation of this law. Like I was saying, I think this is early days, and yeah, there are going to be stumbles. Our kids I don't think that every foster home is an abusive home by any means. I think the point of this law and this switch to keep more kids with their families is predicated on a lot of research that suggests that removing kids, even to a good foster home, does damage to the kid.
Right.
Okay, we're, by the way, if you're just joining us, we're talking about this no confidence vote among unionized workers at the State Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So just finally and briefly, Claudia, what happens next? What should our listeners watch for? Is it the Labor Day deadline? Is that?
Sure, that would be the first thing to look for. Do they get the votes by Labor Day? And then what does Governor Inslee do, if anything?
Yeah. And listeners can catch up on this by a Seattle Times reporter has written about this. Jim Bruner, was it?
Correct.
And the editorial board at Seattle Times. Okay, we're going to take another break because we've got plenty more to cover when it comes to recapping the news of this week. And we are going to be right back. We're streaming the show on YouTube and Facebook. Just search KUOW Public Radio and don't go away.
Support for KUOW comes from Amazon, partnering with local food banks to help meet the needs of families experiencing food insecurity in the Puget Sound. Amazon uses its transportation network to deliver groceries to families and students in need. And from Arch Bright, offering HR, safety, and employment law advice to employers through an annual membership. Includes access to the HR hotline and regional salary and benefits surveys. Details at archbright.com.
Hi, it's Libby Denkman, here to tell you that Soundside is going on tour. You'll be part of a live show taping as we explore Grit City's growing fashion scene. That's September 29th at the Rialto Theater in Tacoma. Get your tickets at kuow.org/events.
Support for KUOW live events comes from Finney Ridge Painting.
You made it to Friday, and we are recapping the news of the week with my guests, Geekwire contributing editor Mike Lewis, The Stranger staff writer Vivian McCall, Seattle Times editorial board member and columnist Claudia Rowe. I'm Bill Radke, and Vivian, in The Stranger, you covered an interesting story. What happens when a city allows a kind of symbolic speech that it wants, inclusive, welcoming diversity, and then that speech is joined by symbols the city does not want. You reported on the city of Duvall in East King County and its so-called Pride Wall or Pride Fence on Main Street. Will you tell us the story?
Yeah, of course. And that Pride Wall was really like think of a chain link fence and then ribbons that are woven through that fence, sort of the image of a pride, like a pride flag. This all begins in 2022 when there's this local business owner who commissioned the wall from a local artist, and there was no real problems. Then there was sort of this battle of flags where first there was this American flag that went up. All right. There's a POW.
And they say, great
flag.
American flag
Yeah,
along with the pride flag.
And
Love it.
the business owner said, like maybe people were trying to make a point there, but like, I don't see a problem with that.
Right.
And then there was a POW flag that went up. Okay. And then there was a Gadsden flag, which is the "Don't Tread on Me" yellow snake. You've seen it.
Yes.
And then finally an "Appeal to Heaven" flag, which is it has a pine tree on it. It's a white flag. It's associated with Christian nationalism and the Christian, identity movement, which is kind of one of the far right movements that is kind of growing in power in the United States right now. And at that point, the city was like, this is too much. That fence was right down the street for a couple blocks from City Hall, and like some employees felt really threatened by that. So they took all the symbols down, not because they wanted to, but they were kind of in this interesting legal position, hypothetically, where that was a city-owned fence. Duvall didn't have rules governing what they should really be doing with signs and public art. And because it's in the public way, that means that it is protected by the First Amendment protections of speech. So hypothetically, somebody could sue if they objected to it. They didn't want to open themselves to that lawsuit. They kind of knew that this was a problem. They were going to deal with it in November. And obviously they had to deal with it a lot sooner.
They have to be content neutral, whatever they do.
Kind of. It's just that they didn't have rules at all. Like it's just, they didn't have a policy. Like Duvall is like so many places in Washington, like a former logging town that became something else. And it became sort of this hippie town. And they had a really cool vibe. It's grown, things have changed over time. It's become a really inclusive community. Like a lot of the trans people that I talked to for this story were saying, like, I really like living here. This is a super comfortable place to live. Nobody gives me any trouble here. It's so nice to have a small town where I can feel this way and exist in this like kind of unchallenged way. And then, this happens, which was obviously upsetting to people. They're trying to work out a solution here, and they had their first public meeting about it. And there were a bunch of people who came forward. I think there were 12 speakers who had something negative to say about the Pride Wall. And a lot of times it just ended up being the association with the pride flag going to lots of anti-trans myths specifically, that being the groomer myth, which is this conspiracy theory that gay people are trying to recruit children and they are pedophiles, which is obviously not true. It's not grounded in reality. It has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Very similar to the other kind of myths that were there that were, trans people did this, trans people did that. It was a lot of that. Yet
about a dozen or so, you said.
About a dozen. And this is not representative of the majority of the town. It really isn't.
At the hearing, were they outnumbered?
There were more people who supported the flag than didn't support the flag.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were not queer themselves. And they just said that they thought it was a good thing for the community. There were people who stood up and said, I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but I found this so upsetting that I thought that I should speak. I think what's happening in Duvall is so reflective of a greater problem that is happening all over the country, where there are small towns that are growing and they're changing and they're becoming more inclusive. And when people want to make a statement like putting up a pride flag, that can cause friction in that community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any reaction?
I think that, one, I'm kind of pleased that many people showed up to defend the reality of putting a pride flag up. It's kind of nice. It's because I think that these small towns are a lot more nuanced sometimes than we think they are. In terms of political views, and sometimes a lot more welcoming than they probably get credit for being. Duvall, like a lot of towns in Washington State, like a lot of small towns across the United States, started off small and sort of insular, and now because it's near a major metropolitan area, it has, and also not that far from Microsoft and other big companies, it's changed. It's changed. I mean, you can look at the political change over the course of the last 30 years in this state, and it's very, very clear how a lot of these towns have changed while still retaining some longtime residents who didn't enjoy this change whatsoever, from property values to changing political views. I'm kind of glad that they're having this open discussion in Duvall. It actually gives it, for I find it in a weird way super encouraging that there is this, that the city is like thinking this through in a methodical way, and that they're inviting a public discussion on this. I think personally that when people have to go up in a meeting and stand up and say something in front of their peers and in front of their, fellow residents, I think that's like the example of what makes a democracy work well, not work poorly.
So I have a question, Vivian. The people who stood up and spoke in support of the original pride flag ribbons being there, were they also in support of the ability for anyone to put up whatever they wanted, such as these other Christian?
Well, I think the issue with like a Christian nationalist symbol, and by extension, the Gadsden flag, is that there is a certain violent message that undercuts that. I mean, that is not a symbol that people put, down in a friendly way. The Christian identity movement and the, far right movements that are next to it and associated with it are dangerous. It's not really the same thing. So I wouldn't really draw that equivalence. I think they were pro people being able to express themselves, but not pro being able to express views that are kind of inherently threatening to people in the community.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about the way the city is handling it is it's so different from a lot of small towns that will sort of just wash their hands of it. They'll say, we don't want anything to do with that. And then the people who are kind of the smallest group, who are also a protected class in this country, are left to figure it out for themselves, which puts them in a really difficult position. And the city is being, really thoughtful, and that it is considering this is an issue in our community. We're actually going to talk about it, and we're going to revise our policy specifically to make sure that we come up with the right solution. We're not going to do something just because we feel that way. We're not going to make a pronouncement about what we do and don't support. We're going to change city policy to really understand what we need to do moving forward.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
heartening.
great.
We're talking about it.
Yeah.
We're coming toward the end of the show. Anything listeners should know about what happens next? Duvall's going to have to make a decision.
Yes, Duvall's going to have to make a decision. What happens next is the city figuring out what they need to do and what's legal, and really understanding how to craft the right policy. And that's going to take a few weeks.
Yeah. Okay. And people can check out your coverage in The Stranger.
They can,
Vivian
yeah.
McCall, or search Duvall.
Search Duvall, The Stranger, and it will come up.
Okay. Nice work. So finally, we're at the part of the show, the end of the show, where I try to find something that made us smile. Something that made me smile was a little bit of good environmental news. It's all relative, right? But at least the Chinook salmon run through the Ballard locks is really good right now. One of the strongest in the last decade. And here is an especially inspiring salmon. KOW reporter Joshua McNichols noticed it swimming past that viewing window at the locks, and a crowd of onlookers noticed it too.
Here's one with a bite in its head. There was a fish, the one that had a chunk out of its head, and it's just amazing to me how remarkable and resilient they are, that they just continue to go. It's astonishing.
Did you see that salmon with a bite out of its back?
Yes. That was brutal, huh? I felt like I want to cheer that fish up. Please continue the journey. It's hard.
Yes, please continue your journey. We need good news right now, Mr. or Mrs. Bitten Salmon. Forgive me, I don't know your name. Wait, I'm told you might have a name. Here to tell us about you is Ballard Locks tour guide Stacy Gilbert, joining the show. Stacy, welcome to the show. Stacy, can you hear me? We'll see if we can work out the audio for Stacy Gilbert from the Ballard Locks. Okay, I'll put that on hold because I wanted to know, how's this fish doing?
I think
Are they tracking
connected.
Doing so? Hopefully, we're going to get Stacy on from the Ballard Locks to tell us. But while we're working that out, she might be underwater. She might be swimming with the fishes. We don't know. Did anything else make you smile? Oh, just a second. Oh, I got a thumbs up. Stacy Gilbert from the Ballard Locks. Can you hear me? Not yet. We can't hear.
It's a little sketchy, but yes.
Oh, okay. I kind of hear you. That we might have to keep this short depending on how your computer sounds. But first of all, I understand you have a name for this maimed fish.
Yeah. Well, we went through several names, but we finally chose Divot.
Divot. Okay.
Yes.
And is it? Do we know that this is probably a seal who took a swipe at Divot?
I would say most likely it was a very fresh wound, and that's the usual source of those kind of wounds is the.
Yes. Okay. So before I lose you, I guess that's the bad news for Divot, except that he survived. He or she? Do we know he or she?
We're leaning towards she, but we don't know for sure.
Okay.
Looks a little bit more like a female from what we can tell. It's a little early to tell. It's easier once they stay in fresh water. Yeah.
So what a lot of people want to know is, well, you know what? I'm going to ask you how Divot is doing, but first, before that, because I don't know how much time I have, I want to know, I said that this year's Chinook run is one of the strongest in the last decade.
Yes.
Why is that? And does it bode well for the future?
You know, there's so many factors. It's hard to say if there's any one factor that's involved, but hopefully it's a sign that things are getting better, that some of the restoration that we're doing on the creeks and rivers is helping, and some of the removal of predators in Lake Washington that the Muckleshoot have been working on, and also a couple of years of cooler water out in the ocean, I think have all contributed.
Cooler water in the ocean. I hadn't heard about that. So all right,
not this year. Sorry.
This year. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard we had the best pink salmon run in a decade in Puget Sound as well. So finally, where is Divot right now? Do we know, Stacey?
So what I know is that Divot left the fish ladder and is on her way, assuming she's a female, to Issaquah. I talked with Issaquah Hatchery. They do expect her to make it there, and I looked at it today, and she's already swam 1,400 miles from Alaska to here. She's determined, and they see salmon with injuries like that every year.
Sure.
So as soon as the water gets cold, they'll be heading up the creek to the hatchery.
Okay, bite or not. Final question then. How can people listening to you right now, if they're curious, is this like we can go watch Divot, or is Divot just going to be, farewell and we'll never know?
So Divot is not visible right now, but if she makes it back to the hatchery, they promise to let us know, and maybe even post something on their website. They've seen the picture, thanks to the story. So they should know what they're looking for and let us know if she makes it.
Okay, well, that would be nice. Any other reaction or question from my panel? We only got a minute and a half.
You know, it's pretty remarkable. If I was on a really important road trip and a bear took a bite of my head,
yes,
I don't think I would keep going.
Right. Hats off to Divot.
I think that in all seriousness, the great news about this, not so much for Divot, because even if Divot makes it to the spawning ground, then Divot is dead.
Yes.
But that Chinooks are what orcas feed on. And so that almost exclusively.
Yes.
And so a good Chinook run is very good for the resident population.
Right. You talked about, Stacey told us about removing predators, but the predators got to eat too. And then this is our food chain. Stacey, we're wishing Divot the best, and thanks for jumping on the show and updating us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Allard Locke's
Good
tour
weekend.
guide Stacey Gilbert telling you about one particular feature of one of the better Chinook runs in quite a while. We are right up at the end of the show, so I just have time to thank you for joining us. The Strangers staff writer Vivian McCall. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you very much for having me.
Geekwire contributing editor Mike Lewis. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
Seattle Times editorial board member and columnist Claudia Rowe. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The show's produced by Kevin Kniestet. And, if you're worried about the political divides in our country, we told you about Duvall talking things out. How can you be a part of a solution? Well, take part in something called One Small Step from StoryCorps. We're pairing strangers with different political views to talk, not politics, just to talk about your lives. And you can sign up for that and get information at kuow.org/story, kuow.org/story. Thank you, Bernard Ouellette, running the board. I'm Bill Radke. We'll be back next week.